how about something else? Although that has happened before when I've been preaching. So he says, that's not right. But since I'm a lawyer and a litigator, I'm used to people telling that's not right. So if there's some important point that you want me to stop and answer your question, that's fine. Otherwise, I'd say wait until the end and we can go over things. But if you really say, hey, I might not remember this and it's important, then we'll just stop then. All right, so I want to talk with you about four main areas today. Number one, the relationship of Christians and their businesses to the government, that is, being able to keep your religious beliefs and your business. Number two is Christian employees. What rights do they have when they come in conflict with employers that don't care about their religious beliefs, including their government employers? The third area is something I touched on in the sermon, which is allowing our churches to be open for worship. That, as I indicated in the sermon, is something that I see as being a huge issue. Adventist eschatology is that will be a defining issue at the end. And then finally, the new threat, anti-Semitism. This is something that has only recently gotten onto my radar. About 2 years ago, a doctoral student at MIT, came to me, I say me, meaning the lawyers at the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, and said, I need help because I'm forced to join or support an anti-Semitic union, a pro-Hamas union. He's Jewish. We were able to work it out for him. But the good news for me was that it opened up my eyes to the extent of anti-Semitism among young people, and it's horrific. So I'll talk about that. So those are the four battlefronts today that I want to talk about. Now, this is my 50th year of litigation. This summer will complete my 50th year. So God willing, I'm still plunging on. So we'll see how long this goes. But over my 50 years, there's been a tremendous change in the attitude of what I would call pagans. I'm going to use the word pagans loosely, not necessarily a derogatory way. But these are people who don't care about God, or people who maybe think there's a God, but it doesn't really make any difference in their life. And so 50 years ago, when I was dealing with religious liberty issues, there would be people who would say, well, I don't get it. I don't understand the religious belief, but hey, this is a free society. In fact, when I was in school, some of my classmates are here. When I was in school, there are all sorts of people who said, you think about the hippie generation, all sorts of people who said, I don't want to conform. I don't want to do what church-going people do. I want to do my own thing. And the uniform attitude was, just let me do what I want to do. I'm doing this because I want to be free. I want to, do my own thing. No one said, that's because we're morally superior to the church-going people. I say no one. There might have been some philosophers out there that put together a philosophy of how, just doing your own thing was somehow morally superior. But that was not a thing then. Today, it has changed completely. The pagans uniformly say, we are morally superior to you. And the reason why we're morally superior to you, Christians, is because we believe in no discrimination for any reason. That's what they say. It's not actually what they think. They do believe in discriminating against Christians and certain other things. But the idea is we just accept everyone. We love everyone. We allow everyone to do what they want to do, and we make no distinctions. Christianity is a religion of distinctions. There's Jesus, and then there's Satan. There's right, and there's wrong. And you make a distinction between what is right and what is wrong. And anyone who tells you that they don't discriminate on any grounds is just, they haven't thought things through. I'll put it that way. I'll be kind and say they haven't thought any things through. Because you discriminate all the time, right? You decide which product you're going to buy, which car you're going to drive, which person you're going to marry, which clothes you're going to. I mean, life is just a series of discriminations where you distinguish between something and another thing. So the bottom line is the new pagans say we don't discriminate, and therefore we are morally superior. And it results in this. Trinity Western University is an overtly Christian school in Canada. Now, I'm going to look first at Canada. I tell you, never look to Canada for religious freedom because it's horrible up there, as this will illustrate. So Trinity Western decided that they were going to start a Christian law school, an overtly Christian law school in Canada. I assume that they had in mind, much like the place where I teach, Regent University School of Law is an overtly Christian law school. And there, Liberty, for example, is another example. We have a number of Catholic schools, law schools, and so on and so forth. So Trinity said, we're going to do this. The most important thing for a law school is to graduate students who can practice law. What's the point of going to law school if you can't practice law? Well, the lawyers in British Columbia province, when they heard that Trinity Western was going to open a law school, took a vote. And they said, we are not going to allow any of the graduates of Trinity Western Law School, when they started, to practice law in British Columbia. Why is that? It's because of the position of Trinity Western on marriage. Trinity Western took a biblical position on marriage. Marriage was between a man and a woman, and sex should be between a married couple. That very uncontroversial position among conservative Christians was the problem that said to the lawyers in the BC, we can't have these people practicing law here. Some other provinces in Canada said the same thing. We will not allow any graduates of Trinity Western to practice law in our province. That, of course, is a serious problem. So Trinity Western went to court. Case went to the Canadian Supreme Court. Canada does not really have a proper First Amendment. I won't get into the discussion of what they have up there. But Trinity Western lost badly. There's only one justice on the Canadian Supreme Court who said, I think they have a right to keep their religious beliefs and run a law school. One. Can you imagine that? So to say you can't have an overtly Christian law school? There are no overtly Christian law schools in Canada. Now let me ask you, who is it that defends religious freedom in a country? It's lawyers, right? And lawyers are on the cutting edge of this. And wouldn't it be helpful to have a lawyer graduate from an overtly Christian law school to understand God's will and the idea of individual freedom and moral freedom? Well, that does not exist in Canada because of this. We can't allow you to exist because we are morally superior. And it all arises from this. I call this the alphabet people. LGBTQ. I can't keep track of all the letters, so I just call them the alphabet people. The alphabet people have long had a complaint about churches. And they say that churches pick us out for special and negative treatment. Now, I'm not going to defend every church. I'm sure that homosexuals coming to a church ran into people sometimes who didn't have enough emotional intelligence, put it that way. But the bottom line is they say it's the church's fault. And this is a very common belief among Christians that, oh, we're really at fault for the conflict between the alphabet people and us. But I will tell you that is nonsense. What the alphabet people have in mind is unlike any other sin. How many of you are familiar with the American Association of Adulterers? What? You never heard of it? Adulterers didn't get together and say to a church, unless you accept us in adultery, well, we're going to close you down. We're going to try to take your tax exemption away from you. How about this? The Association of Equal Rights for Robbers, Thieves, and Muggers. We're robbers, thieves, and muggers. We have a right to control how your church operates because we're morally superior. We made these decisions. The church needs to bend the knee. And so you don't see that because it's the alphabet people who are the only ones that do this. That is why the alphabet people and their allies feel fully empowered to say to Trinity Western, if you don't accept our sin and put your stamp of approval on it, you can't exist. You can't practice. You can't, go to that law school. You can't practice law as a graduate. The concern about this, and I will tell you, for decades I have been warning about the coming conflict with the alphabet people because I consider this to be the greatest religious liberty issue. I'm changing my mind a little bit. And the good news is I think we're turning a corner on this and we're beating the alphabet people. But here's the thing. This is a relatively recent survey. Among young people, nearly 2/3 reported that wedding-based businesses should not be allowed to refuse service to same-sex couples. Well, as you might imagine, when it comes to the alphabet people, where are they most likely to run into conflict? It's with wedding-based or wedding-associated businesses. And so you probably heard about the case of Jack the baker. Jack had the misfortune of having his bakery in Colorado, not a good place. Canada is not a good place to practice your religious beliefs. Colorado is not a good place to practice your religious belief. So Jack Phillips was his name, Jack had the Masterpiece Cake Shop. And if you went into Jack's cake shop, he would have all sorts of cakes that were already made, and anybody could buy any one of those cakes. He didn't ask you about your sexual orientation. He didn't ask you about any sort of protected category. He only wanted to know if you could pay. And so he'd sell these cakes on a non-discriminatory basis other than paying. But Jack was an artist. And Jack would make custom cakes using his skill and his ability to craft the cake. And Jack believed, as many Christians do, that they should exercise their efforts and their talents to advance the kingdom of God, and not exercise their talents and their efforts to defeat the efforts of the kingdom of God. And so when a same-sex couple came to Jack and said, Jack, we've been buying your other cakes, but we want you to create a custom cake for our same-sex marriage. Jack said respectfully, and the record is clear, he was respectful. Jack said, I'm sorry, I can't do that. It's inconsistent with my religious beliefs. And so they went to the state of Colorado. Colorado is all in for putting out of business. Alphabet people put you out of business. Putting out of business Jack's business with regard to the custom cakes. He could do the regular cakes, but he couldn't do that. So, case went up through the Colorado courts, the civil rights agency, and the Colorado Supreme Court, went to the U.S. Supreme Court. Jack had been losing all the way along until he got to the U.S. Supreme Court, and he won at the U.S. Supreme Court. But don't get too excited. Jack did not win a clear religion wins over the alphabet people. Jack won on a technical basis. The Human Rights Commission that ruled against him in Colorado, they said it prejudged his case. So Jack won, but it was a technical basis. So after the case was remanded back down, the alphabet people were determined to put Jack out of business. So they had some other birthday cake to celebrate somebody's birthday who was transsexual. I think that's what it was. And started litigating with him again. Thankfully, Jack was helped by a religious liberty litigation group. So bottom line is it got to the Colorado Supreme Court, and Jack won again. Not straight out, with regard to alphabet versus Christianity, but he won. And today I think they've given up on Jack, but Jack was in court for a very long time You do not want that for yourself. So they're punishing him for his religious beliefs just in the litigation itself. So what do we want? I say we're turning the corner. Here is the best of the turning the corner cases. The name of the case is 303 Creative versus Alanus. This case also arose from Colorado. You can see this is a 2023 case, so all of my cases are pretty recent. Some of them are just brand new. Laurie Smith is a web designer. And so Laurie Smith said, you know what? I'm going to start a business where I create websites for people who are going to get married. Right? You know what I'm talking about, right? You put, the details about your wedding there. You tell the invitees what they should buy you and all these things. I mean, this is extremely common. But Laurie Smith, like Jack Phillips, said, I only want to do this in a way that would bring glory to God. And so I'm only going to create custom websites for heterosexual couples. And because she did not want to offend anyone, she was going to put on her website an explanation of her religious beliefs and why she couldn't do this. It wasn't because she believed in being a bigot. She was doing this because she wanted not to create offense. So because of what had been going on in Colorado, before she actually started the business, they made an inquiry of the government about how they would react to that. And the government said, absolutely not. You have to create these websites for same-sex couples as well as heterosexual couples. And you, in particular, may not put on your website an explanation of your religious beliefs. It's offensive. You can't do that. So Laurie went up through the federal courts. Jack had been going through the state courts. Laurie went up through the federal courts. And the U.S. Court of Appeals is the last stop before the U.S. Supreme Court. The various U.S. courts of appeals, there are 11 of them in the country, are essentially the last stop for every case. Very few cases are decided by the Supreme Court. And the Court of Appeals that took Laurie's case bent itself in a pretzel to rule against her. I won't get into what I teach my students in law school, except to say this. If you have a traditional First Amendment right, generally speech, religion is not considered to be a traditional First Amendment right under this test anymore. And I can answer your questions about that if you want. But in essence, this was litigated under speech rights. And if the government is going to interfere with your free speech, the government has to show, in order to win the case, and the government has the burden of proof, has to show that there is a compelling state interest behind quashing your religious beliefs. And it has to show that its method of quashing your speech rights is the least restrictive way the government could go about and do these. Now, generally, in the past, when a case is put, a right is tested against this traditional compelling state interest, least restrictive alternative, the plaintiff wins. It's a very hard standard for the government to win. So Laurie went up to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals says, oh, yeah, there is a compelling state interest to protect the alphabet people. They should have the right to have websites as well. Okay. The second test was, is it the least restrictive alternative? How many people do you know make websites? There were tons of competitors to Laurie Smith who made wedding-based websites. There was no way the government could win the least restrictive alternative because any same-sex couple could go to the next web designer and have their wedding featured on the website. It's not like the old racial cases where you couldn't find a hotel room in the city if you were of that race. Not at all. But Laurie lost under the least restrictive alternative. And how did the Court of Appeals do this in their pretzel action? They said, Laurie is a unique individual, as are every one of you here, right? You're all unique. And they said, the least restrictive alternative here is whether or not other web designers are the same as Lori. And the court said, no, she's a unique person. She's like a snowflake, no other flakes are quite like hers. And so that is why it is the least restrictive alternative to force Lori to create websites for same-sex couples. And I talk about it to others. The test means nothing if that is the standard. A dissent in that case said, that's absurd. Court of Appeals generally sit in 3-judge panels, and one of the judges said, that's absurd. Went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court said, that is absurd. At least 6 of the justices did. 3 dissented. So, Lori won. It's a straight-out win, but not under religion, but speech. One of the fellow faculty members at Regent pioneered the law in this area to cast religious freedom cases as speech cases because the law is more favorable for speech than religion. But nevertheless, she won against the alphabet people. Very clear victory. Another clear victory against the alphabet people is the Sharon Fulton versus City of Philadelphia case. Catholic Social Services has been working for 200 years in Philadelphia. At the very beginning, they were running orphanages for kids without parents, and more recently, they have been running adoption services. Now, I don't know much about this area. Some of you may be experts in it. But the way this normally runs in this case, and according to my understanding, is that when a judge wants to place a foster child, when an adoption needs to be approved by the government, probably because it came out of a government case, there are private agencies that certify homes as being acceptable to take a child. I mean, obviously, you don't want to put the child just anywhere. So there are these private agencies that do that. Catholic Social Services had been in this business for a long time. Catholic Social Services would not certify a same-sex couple home. The Catholic Church considers homosexuality to be a grave disorder, consistent with the teachings of the church. They said, no, we're not going to do that. No complaints. No one who came to Catholic Social Services said, hey, they've got a problem. Instead, what happened was there was a complaint against another agency in Philadelphia, and there was a news report about it. And the news report, in talking about the agency with the complaint against it, happened to mention that Catholic Social Services would not certify a same-sex marriage home for adoption or placement of a foster child. When the city council learned this, they were outraged. And they said, Catholic Social Services, you are no longer able to certify homes. Now, I will tell you, there's a real problem in Philadelphia. There are not enough agencies to help in placing all the children. And Catholic Services are doing a great deal of the work. And so this was absolutely harming children to do this. So Sharon Fulton, the lady in the picture, was a frequent flyer for taking in foster children. And she worked with Catholic Social Services. So Sharon and the Catholics went up to the U.S. Supreme Court to say, this violates our religious beliefs. Supreme Court ruled in favor of Catholic Social Services. So you can see this again is the alphabet lobby against the Catholic Church. And they won. And the reason why they won, I'm going to call it a merits decision because it is. But one of the things about a compelling state interest that you have to prove is that you can't make all sorts of exceptions. If you have all sorts of exceptions, it's not a compelling interest, right? And so Philadelphia made all sorts of exceptions with regard to the placement of children. And so the U.S. Supreme Court said, no. So the city of Philadelphia, you lose. The Catholics win. Wonderful decision. I filed a brief in that case. The most recent one is June 27, 2025, Mahmoud versus Taylor in Maryland. And I'm going to be honest, they're grooming children to join the alphabet crew. I mean, they are. They have pro-alphabet books in their library. They have pro-alphabet teachers that promote this. And if you think that I'm exaggerating that, you need to look at some of the statistics of this. Kinsey said something like, 2% of the population is gay. Today, if you ask young people, something like 30% say, well, either gay or bi. That did not happen organically, that's to say, this is a social contagion. There's a lobby going on, and the lobby is going on in our public schools, which is a very important reason to go to our Adventist schools. So a group of parents, Muslim, Catholic, and others, said, wait a minute, Maryland public schools. In the past, the Maryland public schools had said, well, if you don't want your child to hear this stuff, you can get them exempted from the class. And then the alphabet lobby said, but wait a minute, the children who remain in the classroom are going to feel bad because some are leaving. Their feelings are going to be hurt. And so Maryland said, okay, no one can leave. We're not going to tell parents in advance when we're going to be doing this. No one can leave, and your kids are subject to reading those books. Went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. U.S. Supreme Court said, absolutely, parents have a right, even in the public schools, to control their education to this degree, that they are entitled to be told in advance when this kind of thing is going to be promoted to their children, and have the right to exempt their children from hearing this. And with regard to the books, there's a parental notification part. So this is, once again, a straight-out victory for religious liberty. And as you might imagine, well, maybe you don't know, I mean, Muslims are not in for the children being educated this way. Conservative Jews are not in for this. So there's a pretty large segment of the parental group that say, hey, wait a minute, pay my taxes, compulsory education exists in my state, I should have a say, and the Supreme Court agreed. So Matthew 5:11 says, blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. You can bet there's a huge amount of blowback on that. You see this all the time. Tremendous, because they have a morally superior point of view, right? Then you are engaged in evil, and you are engaged in wrongdoing. All right, let me redirect this more toward this audience, right? Let me talk about Seventh-day Adventist rights. Traditional Seventh-day Adventist problems in the workplace come in two major areas. Number one is the Sabbath. We teach you shouldn't work on the Sabbath, from sundown Friday to sundown Sabbath. And the church has had a very long-standing teaching, not all Adventists understand this, that church members should not join or financially support a labor union. This teaching actually finds its genesis in the time of the Civil War. The church took a position against its members being involved in combat. And when labor unions became a thing, the church said, well, wait a minute, that was actual war, this is industrial war. We think the same thing. We don't think our members should be involved in that. So it's not a very high profile teaching of the church, but it's a long-term teaching. And it is that, and the Sabbath is what has gotten more Adventists fired and more Adventists in trouble because of their religious beliefs. So I filed a brief in this case, and you can see that maybe. The name of the case is Groff versus DeJoy. Groff versus DeJoy. Mr. Groff, Gerald Groff, is not a Sabbath keeper. He's a Sunday keeper. But he is a very devout guy. And he worked for the Postal Service. And you might say, why would a Postal Service employee have a religious liberty problem with working on Sunday? Postal Service doesn't work on Sunday. They don't deliver mail to me. Unless, as I mentioned this in the sermon, you live in Andrews University where the post office is closed on Saturday and open on Sunday. So our buddy Jeff Bezos is the problem because Amazon entered into a contract with the Postal Service to deliver Amazon packages on Sunday. Suddenly, Mr. Groff was told you have to work on Sunday. He engaged in heroic efforts, really a good plaintiff, I would say, because he transferred his job to another postal service that wasn't making Amazon deliveries. He did everything he could to try to prevent himself from losing his job because of his religious beliefs. The post office also, to their credit, did a lot to help him. The postmaster general in the one post office where he was delivering packages on Sunday, so Mr. Groff wouldn't have to. Case comes down to where he's getting discipline after discipline after discipline, and it's clear under the standards that the post office has that he's going to be fired. So he quit instead of being fired and filed a lawsuit. Now, this group may be of some interest to you. You say, who are those guys? Those are the lawyers who represented Gerald DeGroff. I mean, I told you my brief. I was representing someone else who was coming to the court saying, we're a friend of Gerald DeGroff. These are the reasons why you should rule in his favor. But I didn't represent the plaintiff. I wasn't counsel of record for the plaintiff. But the guy on the left is Alan Reineck. Alan is the religious liberty man for the Pacific Union Conference. And Alan has taken a lot of postal worker cases in the past. And he's the most active of the public affairs and religious liberty guys out in the divisional area. And I've litigated with Alan in the past. He was a counsel of record. He helped get this case to the U.S. Supreme Court. The guy on the right, I believe, is the one who argued it. He was at our law school just not too long ago, and I believe it was him. So what's the issue? I mentioned in my sermon Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and I said with regard to religion, it's got two faces. Number one, you can't pick an employee out for special and adverse treatment because of their religious beliefs. We wouldn't hire a Methodist. You're a Catholic? How'd you get hired? Well, you're fired. Seventh-day Adventists wouldn't consider having you working here. So you have the right under this federal law to be treated just like everyone else, regardless of your religious beliefs. But Adventists and others, like Gerald DeGroff, sometimes need to be treated differently. Everyone has to work on Saturday. Everyone has to work on Sunday. And you say, well, wait a minute. This conflicts with my religious beliefs. I won't go into all the history of this, but this has been a development in the law. Congress changed the law. And so Congress changed the law to say, well, we're going to have a second face on religious liberty for employees. And that second face is that if your religious beliefs conflict with a work requirement, the employer is required to reasonably accommodate your religious beliefs. Attempt to reasonably accommodate your religious beliefs. But the employer or union or the placement agency have a get-out-jail-free card. And that get-out-jail-free card is unless the accommodation would create an undue hardship. If it's an undue hardship to give you Sabbath off, well, employer has no more obligation. Union has no more obligation. So, right after that statute was passed, adding the accommodation provision, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a case called Transworld Airlines versus Hardison, decided, well, Congress didn't say exactly what undue hardship means. What do you think undue hardship means? Doesn't undue hardship mean a hardship plus? I mean, it's got to be an undue hardship. The Supreme Court, in all its wisdom, and I think this is an conservative activist court, said, we think an undue hardship would be anything more than a de minimis burden. De minimis is a term of art in the law, more than a trifle. More than a trifle. If it costs the employer more than a trifle, a little bit more than a trifle, then the employer, the union, gets a get out of jail free card. What? The dissent in the case said that violates the rules of English. That was 40 years ago. In fact, let me tell you just a little bit about that. Do you not want me to get into detail on these cases or not? I mean, is it getting boring when I get into details? Or no? Okay. So Trans World Airlines was the employer. Larry Hardison, the plaintiff, was a Sabbatarian, not an Adventist, but a Sabbatarian. Trans World Airlines is nothing now, right? But then it was either the largest or second largest airline in the United States. What would be a hardship on a corporation of that size? If it lost $1 million, would that be a hardship? I would say no. It wouldn't affect its stock price at all. The dissent said in the Hardison case that paying Larry Hardison or paying someone else $150 in overtime to take Larry Hardison's place would have cured the problem. $150. And the U.S. Supreme Court said that's an undue hardship. And Hardison lost. I can get into it's more complicated than that, but that's it on the face. So, 40 years later, the Groff case comes. And the U.S. Supreme Court in Groff said, the statute means what it says. A hardship is a difficulty, a serious problem for an employer, and an undue hardship is more than a serious problem. And so for employers and unions and placement agencies to get a get-out-of-jail-free card by saying they're suffering undue hardship, they have to show real hardship. The world has changed. Tons of Adventists have lost their job over Sabbath accommodation. That should change now because employers have to show real hardship. Real hardship. Unions have to show real hardship. In all of my religious cases against unions, I never lost on the undue hardship issue, but it is theoretically there. Okay, that is one of the most important cases for you to keep in mind. The next case, recent case, 2024, is Muldrow versus City of St. Louis. And I'll just say this is a sex discrimination case. Doesn't have anything to do with religion. But in every one of these civil rights cases, the judges say, we're only going to look at a case if there's some rather serious harm to the plaintiff employee. In some circuits it was you had to be fired or suspended or something that really interfered with your job. And the circuits were sort of back and forth on this. Muldrow came to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said once again, the statute says what it means. You can't discriminate against employees based on these protected categories. And so a court will not take a case of hurt feelings. They said something bad to me because I go to church on Sabbath. But if it harms your job in some real way, you're entitled to go into court. You're entitled to have your day in court and win. All right, the other blockbuster case for Seventh-day Adventists on the union dues front is this case. This case was litigated by my shop. I was involved in this litigation. It's called Genis versus AFSCME. And 40 years ago, we took a case to the U.S. Supreme Court. I was with the foundation then. And it was, the Supreme Court decided, it was Abood versus Detroit Board of Education was the name of the case. And we said to the U.S. Supreme Court, if you're a public employee, and therefore the U.S. Constitution applies to public employees, you cannot require any employee to either join or financially support a labor union. That is what you should hold. The court said, no, that's not what we're going to hold. We're going to hold you can't be forced to actually join the union, but you can be required to pay for collective bargaining costs. Have any idea how difficult it is to figure out how much a union spends on collective bargaining costs as opposed to political costs? It's like any other service organization. Like 60 to 70% of its budget is directed toward paying employees. So you have to know what employees do. You think these employees are keeping fair timesheets when they know this has to do with how much the union gets to keep and how much gets paid to those ornery non-members? These were multi-million-dollar cases. They're like complicated antitrust cases. I had one, and I was working to litigate this on the cheap against the National Education Association. And we did all sorts of things to limit the cost of this case. This case cost the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation over $1 million just for out-of-pocket costs. You can see no individual employee could possibly afford this. That's not counting what the foundation paid me, paid another lawyer that was working on it, paid a CPA who was employed by the foundation. That case actually went on for 20 years, 53-day trial, 8,000 pages of transcript, went 3 times to the U.S. Supreme Court, 4 times to the state Supreme Court. Incredibly complicated case. Well, comes Janice. And Janice comes to the court, and Janice says, enough is enough. You know, you're not protecting non-members' First Amendment rights by requiring them to engage in this kind of litigation. And unions in the public sector, when involved in collective bargaining, are involved in political activities. Ask the state of Illinois, is on the verge of bankruptcy, presumably, because of the negotiated pension agreements. U.S. Supreme Court rules it is a violation of the First Amendment to require any public employee to pay any money to a labor union. And so just like that, every Seventh-day Adventist who worked at any level of government was freed from having to support a union. You didn't have to go and say, please accommodate me, prove you're sincere. They'd have the undue hardship defense. You just had the right to say, no, I'm not joining. And that is it. Now, that's for public sector employees. It's very important because if you look at the level of unionization in the United States, 30-some% of public employees are unionized. So that's the highest percentage. In the private sector, only 6% of employees are unionized. So most private sector employees are not obliged to join or financially support a labor union. In addition, there are right-to-work states. And in right-to-work states, you cannot be required to join or financially support a union. You might recognize Tennessee is there. And so Tennessee is a right-to-work state. And so if you're working for a private employer in Tennessee, you don't have to join or financially support a union, even though Janus does not apply to you. Now, lawyers always have to have footnotes, right? You have to say, well, there's some exception. Well, one of the exceptions is if you work in the railroad and airline industry in a right-to-work state, well, you can still be required to join or pay fees, and you have to assert your rights under Title VII. And if you work in a federal enclave, which is generally by a military base, it's not unclear which law applies to you. All right, so those are the issues that specifically apply to Seventh-day Adventists, and it's all good news. I mean, it's all good news. Here are some that might very well apply to Seventh-day Adventists. Let's say you work in the public schools. You want to share your faith. Is that okay? You might have heard, this is a famous case, Kennedy versus Bremerton. This is Coach Kennedy who was kneeling in the football field praying, and the students came and they wanted to be with him. He got fired over that. The Supreme Court got the case and said, no, you've got a right to keep your religious beliefs while you're working for the public schools. You can't be coercing students, but you have the right to practice your religious beliefs. And they changed the test. I'm not going to get into this because of the complexity of this, but they changed the test to make it more favorable for individuals who wish to exercise their religious beliefs in government. Here's a case that is very important for our church. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Seventh-day Adventist Church has the largest system of private Protestant schools in the world. In the world. They're very large. And I'm on the accreditation board for all of these Adventist schools in the world. And I believe the last number they showed me, there are 10,000 Adventist schools. Can you imagine that? It's just amazing. So, well, amen, right? Amen. Not all in the United States. This is worldwide. Here's what this case is about. Our Lady of Guadalupe versus Agnes. This is the second of two cases the U.S. Supreme Court looked at that dealt with what's known as the ministerial exception. If you believe in church-state separation at a very primitive level, you would say at least the government can't tell the Seventh-day Adventist Church who should be president of the General Conference. They can't tell you who should be the pastor in your church. And the past president, Ted Wilson, can't say who shall be the president of the United States. Ernest Kohler is the new GC president. He can't tell, who should be the president of the United States. So it's supposed to be hands-off with regard to each affecting the others. So this case comes to the court, and this is a church school teacher in a Catholic school. She has cancer. There's no doubt about the fact she has cancer. And there's also no doubt about the fact that she was fired. And so she says, there's a federal statute that says you have to accommodate disabled people. She says the Catholic Church violated federal civil rights laws by not accommodating me. And the Catholic Church says, she's a lousy teacher. Who gets to decide that? Can the government, now, what's a church school teacher? Church school teacher is a spokesperson for the church. Can the government say, this person is going to be your spokesperson? Supreme Court said no. This is the ministerial exception. and so if you are a pastor, close your ears, any pastors here. If you're a church school teacher, you no longer have the advantage of any of the federal civil rights or state civil rights, because this was based on the U.S. Constitution. And so churches can overtly violate the typical rules on non-discrimination. But the reason is you don't want to have the government in there saying, well, what's the church's real motive? Do you trust the government to do that? Judges to do that? I don't trust them. The exciting part was just after the prior case was decided, and all of our church school teachers in the United States were meeting in Nashville for their annual meeting. And so they asked me to come and explain to all these teachers how they no longer had any civil rights with regard to their job. And so they loved me, of course. Anyway, so this is a very important church-state separation case. This case, Chiki Usabanam, I'm glad I'm not his lawyer because I have to pronounce his name properly. Chiki is what I'll call him. Chiki is a little Christian witness. He went to Gwinnett College in Georgia. You may have heard of it. And Chiki wanted to share the gospel. And so Gwinnett College had a very repressive policy. They said you can only express your your views to other students if you are in a public expression zone. They actually had geographical public expression zones. And I just looked at the case again. It was like 1/100% of the property that the school was on was a public expression zone. And so, and you had to get a prior permit to express your views. So Chiki got his permit from Gwinnett College. He was standing in the public expression zone, preaching away, telling others about the gospel. Obviously, he couldn't chase after anyone. He was just there. But, pagans think their views are morally superior, and some were offended that he could even do that, and so they complained. And Gwinnett College said, sorry, Chiki, we're not going to allow you to say anything that offends anybody. So much for your... Gwinnett College is a state school, so this First Amendment applies. So Chiki took his case up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and when it got to the U.S. Supreme Court, the Gwinnett College said, and Chiki had also graduated by this time, the college said, oh, we don't have that policy anymore. We renounced that policy. This is a favorite tactic by bad guys. They will have an oppressive policy. You have to litigate it. You take it to the U.S. Supreme Court. And when the Supreme Court takes it, you say, oh, never mind, because you figure the Supreme Court's going to rule against you because your case is moot, they say. Good thing about Cheeky's case is the Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to apply the mootness doctrine when one party is trying to just kick out the case so we won't decide it. By the way, in our Janice case, they tried to do that to us. All right, let's turn to Gardner about where does the battle rage. And this is what I was saying in my sermon I talk about in more detail. Remember I said in the sermon, sad thing that no Seventh-day Adventist church contested being forced to close. We all said, yes, sir, 3 bags full, and we closed their churches. Can you imagine? Most fundamental right to worship. And we said, okay. You know, especially think about this. We said, okay, because the government said you're going to be injuring health. You know, Ellen White talks about sort of the circumstances that are going to surround this idea of saying that we can't worship together. And it's going to be, you know, things are going on, you know, earthquakes, things are going on in the atmosphere, things are going on that just make some people say the gods must be angry, and they're angry at this crew. That's it. So this is very similar because we're talking about health. Well, not everyone rolled over. A home church group in California, and that's the Tandon case I've got here, wanted to meet together. And the state of California, in its wisdom, said, well, 3 families can meet together, but more than that can't. And so they said, wait a minute, we have the right to get together and worship in person, you know. And I said during the sermon, let me say it again, if a church decides voluntarily to be closed during a pandemic, that's fine with me. You know, with regard to the First Amendment, if the church says we won't want to threaten old guys like Bruce Cameron, okay. But the government says you close, oh, that's something else. And the Tandem people said no. They sued Governor Newsom, went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and went to the U.S. Supreme Court on a preliminary injunction. Now, the importance about preliminary injunction is twofold. Number one, it's not a resolution of the case, not a final resolution of the case. But in order to get an injunction, you have to prove likelihood of success on the merits. So the court is opining about the merits. And court ruled in favor of Tandon. The other case, our Catholic friends in New York brought a case against Cuomo and said, hey, you know, we have a right to meet in person. And you might remember, it's not just meeting in person, but it had to do with, could you sing? You know, how many people could be assembled in the church, so on and so forth. And of course, the issue was that strip clubs were open and beer joints were open and what have you. And you say, wait a minute. The Supreme Court said in both these cases, we're granting a preliminary injunction to stop the state of New York, the state of California, from limiting worship. So, do we know how this will come out? This is a preliminary injunction. You know, the Supreme Court may not be constituted the way it is. By the way, we have 6 Catholics on the Supreme Court, and they're all voting wonderfully with regard to religious liberty. So we don't know what's happened, but this is where the battle rages. Now, there's a new battle for Sabbath that I mentioned in the sermon as well. And this is new to me, and this is shocking. I mentioned at the very beginning. It's anti-Semitism. You know, I talked in the sermon about how, you know, the traditional Adventist thing, look for, you know, the rise of Sunday laws, then you'll know the end of time is here. And so, you know, public affairs and religious liberty people in the church and their friends, I just make stuff up like Project 2025. I'm not going to get into that again to explain why. They're just making it up with regard to that's not a Sunday law or a precursor to a Sunday law. But here is the real threat. And this is how I got to know this. Currently, I'm litigating on behalf, helping, and I'm not sure if we have any actual before the agency cases, but we deal with these cases all the time and are helping the individuals. Some of our premier schools, such as the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, say with regard to graduate students, you have to join or financially support a labor union. You say, wait a minute, how does a graduate student, someone working on their doctorate, have anything to do with a labor union? It happens like this. If you are working on your PhD, and sometimes on your MA, the school will say, we want you to be involved and teaching and research and what have you, and we're going to pay you. That makes the degree more affordable. So the National Labor Relations Board, in all its wisdom, said, well, these students are employees, and therefore you can force them to join or financially support a labor union. And one of the most active unions in organizing employees is the electrical workers. And this is, and you know, you hear people who exaggerate. This union, when it started, was a communist union. That's why the United Electrical Workers is the union you hear of today, not the UE, the United Electrical Workers. The UBEW is the primary, because the UE was a communist union. And employees say, well, I'm not sure I want to join the communists. I'm not saying they're a communist union today, but that gives you an idea of how they've looked at this. And so they're organizing these students, and they are all in for Hamas. They're all in for Palestine. And so I have Jewish students. They want to finish their doctorate. They want to finish their master's. And they're told they have to join or financially support a union that wants to take out their country. Right? That's the goal. From the river to the sea. Right? And so they say, hey, what can we do? Well, we're helping them under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. If it's a public school, then we win under Janus. But the importance of this is not just this amazing story, but it has educated me about the extraordinary levels of anti-Semitism among our young people. I don't know, you know, if you're of a certain age, you understand Germany. You understand, you know, where anti-Semitism ends, you know. Only used to be these little fringe crazy people that were anti-Semitic, but that's not the case with our young people. Harris Campaign, Kamala Harris Campaign, they have a polling firm called the Blue Rose Research, and they did research. This is research obviously on the left as opposed to the right. I'll show you on the right in just a minute. And their polling said that 18-year-old registered voters had about 25% anti-Semitism. 25%. For older people, 65 or older, it was 6%. And Blue Rose says it's an equal problem whether conservative or liberal. The numbers didn't quite bear that out, but the Manhattan Institute, which is a center-right group, I would say, they might contest that, I don't know. They are polling Republicans, and they found that if you were under 50, 25% of Republicans openly express anti-Semitic views. For those over 50, the number drops to just 4%. So they actually are very consistent with the Blue Rose group. Now, here's the thing. Well, let me, if I get this next slide. Here's the thing. It's not just you're anti-Semitic because you're sympathetic for the Palestinians. You've got some sort of position with regard to Israel and Palestine. No, one of the questions was, do you dislike Jewish people? So it had to do with just your opinion on Jews and huge numbers. I consider this to be a huge number. Especially, how does you think about this and you think about the young people, no discrimination against anyone for any reason. Ha 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 ha. Not with regard to Jews and not with regard to Christians. So why does that matter to us? And I touched on this in the sermon. Adventists have traditionally been taught, if you go to our schools, pay attention in our churches, that Sabbath changed to Sunday because Roman Emperor Constantine decreed it. And the Catholic Church said, that's right. We should worship on Sunday instead. You talk to your neighbor, why do you go to church on Sunday? And your neighbor will say, Jesus rose on Sunday. That's why we go. So all of these things are true. It's historically true about Constantine. It's historically true about the Catholic Church. Obviously, you just ask your neighbor and you'll find out that that is true. But that is only part of the picture, and the other part of the picture was never taught to me in our schools or our churches. And I tend to think I had my ears open. I was never taught that anti-Semitism was a major driver. About 20 years ago, because I do a lot of litigation with devout Jew. In fact, the good or sad thing is that when he came to work for us, he was a liberal Jew. He didn't really care about religion. And his relationship with me converted him to a devout Jew. I was never able to convert him to Christianity, and he tells me today, knock it off, Bruce. You know, this is offensive. Okay. But he said to me, Bruce, you need to read some of these books on the history of Jews. And so I was looking at that, and I had never heard this about anti-Semitism. Well, as I said in church, Sam Bakioki, a Seventh-day Adventist scholar, taught at Andrews, now has passed away, wrote the book, which many of you have, From Sabbath to Sunday, probably in your library. And he said, anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism. And I said in the sermon, I say again, if President Biden told you to do something, or President Trump told you to do something, so what? What changes the hearts of individual people? They have their own opinion about things. And so the change from Sabbath to Sunday was directly the result of the average person saying, we don't like Jews. We don't want to be involved with them anymore. We don't want to worship on their day of worship. Justin was one of the early fathers, and he said this: the two fundamental institutions of Judaism, namely circumcision and the Sabbath, were a brand of infamy imposed by God on the Jews to single them out for punishment they so well deserve for their wickedness. So attending church, worshiping on Saturday, is a punishment from God because of their wickedness. You wouldn't want to be joining in with those people who are punished by God for their wickedness. All right. History repeats itself. I think if Sabbath worship changed to Sunday worship in the age of the early church, primarily because of anti-Semitism, what makes you think that won't happen again with regard to the question of Sabbath versus Sunday worship? And that's why I say this is important. Yes, sir. In fact, let me just say, I'm at the end of if you wanted me to go into church-state separation, I could go into that. But let's take questions. Yeah. I think part of it, yes. But the general idea that, there's more than this. Have you ever heard the term blood libel? The idea is that the Jews killed Jesus, but they're also eating children, Christian children, and they're engaged in all sorts of wicked activity. They were stealing money from people, cheating them in their business. It was like an overall attack that these are bad people. But part of it was certainly killing Christ.
Yeah, I've been fascinated by this whole anti-Semitism over the past couple of years, because even most people that I know that are that way, they don't tie it to a religion. They just, they should just let Palestinians free. They don't even know why they're anti-Semites. And I'm just wondering what the rise of this was. Is it being taught in public schools that the Jews are bad?
Well, I would say it's demonic. There's a controversy going on between Christ and Satan. And in fact, when I was preaching saying, well, maybe closer than you think, this is not just individuals doing their own thing. This is demonic. Mm-hmm. How many people do you hear on TV who are arguing their position, and can't you say, that sounds demonic? Yeah. It sounds ridiculous. Just completely irrational, completely wicked. It's just unbelievable. So that's what I think it is. Just like, the question is why? Why is this? In every empire, Jews were targeted, right? And in the American empire now, for the first time, Jews are being targeted. Jeff?
I'm kind of surprised and not surprised about, I think most, okay.
No, they're recording.
Bruce, I think with most people, as we grew up, we didn't hear anti-Semitism as we do now. But have you done any kind of, in that under 50, is there a timeline when you could see what was the reason when this ramped up and when did it start? I mean, we came from parents of the greatest generation, specifically your father was involved in it. And my father was older than yours, but we were always for the Jews. It seemed like going through our parochial school when we went to the academy and elementary school.
Yeah, I mean, you see, we were unusual, Jeff, in that the Jews were the chosen people. You know, I thought Jews were a historic figure. When my first orientation meeting at Emory University School of Law, a guy gets up, a professor gets up, Orntlicker was his name, and the guy next to me nudges me and says, he's Jewish. And I'm saying, how do you know? He doesn't have a staff in his hand. He's not wearing a robe. How would you know he's Jewish? You know, this was the most amazing thing to me. Come to find out, Emory is one of the favorite schools for Jewish students. I'd say a third of our class was Jewish. I learned so much about Jews that I never knew when we were in school. A, they are alive and well and around today, and B, they had a particular interest in me because I kept Sabbath, and I knew more about their Sabbath and their celebrations than they did because they were generally secular Jews. So they would call me a goyim. That's the term for someone who's not a Jew. But they were very interested in me, and I was interested in them because this was a new thing. By the time I graduated from law school, I knew all sorts of things about Jews. But I think that for me, Jeff, and you, and the rest of us from Andrews, they were the great people of the Old Testament, right? And so I don't remember. I mean, obviously the Klan was anti-Semitic, but how many people were in the Klan when we got older? I mean, it used to be stronger early on. This new stuff is Klan stuff. That's what it is, John? Oh, well.
Yeah, in the study that I just saw on the screen, what percentage of the young people that were Democrats were anti-Semitic?
It's about the same.
And what percentage of the Democrats that were over 50 were anti-Semitic?
Yeah, the numbers are about the same. Whether Democrat or Republican, if you're a young person, about 25% are anti-Semitic. It's the same. It's essentially the same. I'm not saying the numbers are identical, but they're close. With regard to older people like you and I, John, the numbers are low, like 4%, 6%, something like that. And the Manhattan Institute says over 50. If you're over 50 and you're a Republican, then the percentage of anti-Semitism is low. And I believe that for our generation, I mean, Jeff and I and the people at Andrews Academy grew up in a bubble, right? But I think that for everyone else, their parents had been involved in World War II. They knew the horror of this. Jews were fleeing to the United States for freedom. Jews, smartly, were taking over high positions in the media and government, I think in part to prevent things from going sideways. And so that's why I think we all who are older knew the lesson that it was just evil to discriminate against Jews who wanted to kill them. The young people apparently believe that there's some sort of morality in considering those people offensive, which completely makes no sense under the the theory of the alphabet people, no discrimination against anyone at any time. It's completely nonsensical, and that's why I say to you, I think it's demonic.
Do you think it's has a parallelism with the rise of socialism in the United States?
Yes, because almost all of the communist countries are anti-Semitic. So yeah, Israel exists because of the anti-Semitism in Russia, in part. The UN created Israel. Yeah, and once again, what's the link? This gets back to the demonic thing. If you have a nation that rejects God, the collective is the supreme, then what limit is there on your actions? None. I mean, I've got a slide here. James Madison, this is such an interesting thing. I'm glad you asked this. James Madison is considered to be the author of the First Amendment, right? So in his memorial and remonstrance, he said this right, religious freedom, is in its nature an unalienable right. It is unalienable because what is here a right toward men is a duty toward the Creator. So let me just stop right there. So James Madison is saying, each of us owes an obligation to afford the rest of the citizens religious liberty. Why? Because God requires it. That makes it unalienable. It's given by God. It can't be taken away. And if you are a follower of God, you have an obligation to afford religious liberty to others. This duty is precedent both in order of time and in degree of obligation to the claims of civil society. We maintain, therefore, that religion is wholly exempt from the cognizance of civil society. Do you ever ask yourself why in the First Amendment free exercise of religion is listed first? Because James Madison is the primary author, and he said it's primary in terms of precedent. So he put in first, but he also says degree of obligation. He says the claims of civil society are not allowed to touch the religious beliefs and practices of individuals. We wouldn't have any of this litigation with the alphabet people or any other people that want to infringe on religious liberty if that were applied, that religion is primary. That's what we're going to protect first. So your point is very well taken. Godless countries make up their own demonic rules, and they're not constrained by a belief that there's a God in heaven. And when you look at how does the Bible treat Jews, I mean, this is God's people. The heroes of the Old Testament are all Jewish. You ask why does Satan continue to attack Jews? I'm not completely comfortable with the teaching of some of our principal Adventists who say Jews no longer matter. I think they matter. Otherwise, I don't think Satan would still be, unless the guy really holds grudges forever. I mean, I think they still matter. And in fact, Paul says there's going to be an incoming, we're grafted into the root of Judaism, Gentiles are, and there'll be a time when the Jews will come in, and we shouldn't get arrogant about our relationship to the Jews just because we're grafted in, because we're after our graft. We're not the root.
Christianity, they got to go through the door, and Christ is the door.
Right. Oh, I agree.
So it's on an individual basis.
Yeah.
On a national basis, no, they have been rejected.
Right.
But on an individual basis, anyone that go through the door can be grafted into the tree of Christ.
That is right. But think about this. When it comes to religious liberty for people who have not come through the door, isn't the garden the most critical message? That God let Adam and Eve choose. What a stupid decision, right? It's cast us all into sin and all of these problems. So if God decided it in the context of this, then clearly, as James Madison says, our duty to the Creator God, and look at how he says it. Duty toward the Creator. He's talking about Genesis, right? Is that you give others religious liberty. You let them choose, Okay. Yeah, John. Can you give him the mic?
You're helping me remember a lot. We were young.
That's good. It's good to remember when we were young.
You remember, we were going to the Berrien Springs Village Church.
Uh-huh.
Do you remember the German families that moved into Michigan in the Berrien Church? And
Yes.
you remember them?
G-
And you
Grunwald
remember
or-
they could not speak English?
Yeah, yeah.
And you remember we experienced no anti-Semitism from them.
No.
I don't remember ever hearing hatred for Jews.
Yeah, and we didn't
You
show
remember
hatred toward them either. The fact that they came from, Germany. My Jewish friend, for example, Jeff's got a Mercedes-Benz. I used to drive Mercedes. He won't drive a Mercedes. He drives Japanese cars, which did equally terrible things then. I mean,
Now, I've lived here for 50 years,
Yeah.
moved from up north, and ran into some of my friends who were very prejudiced toward the blacks.
yeah.
You may have run into some of that too.
Oh, well, this is an age thing, right? I mean, when I first moved to Northern Virginia, I was the chairman of the nominating committee, a job you never want to have, right? And I came into that job and I was going to vote for the existing head elder / lay pastor who was a white guy. And someone raised a question about a black guy being the lay pastor. Thought about this, I prayed about it, and I felt that I should vote for the black guy. And so I did. That caused some backlash to me. I mean, do I care? No, for example, the primary medical doctor his wife would walk out of the church when she was the organist when a black preacher would preach. So there's some harsh feelings, and they were raised that way and what have you. By the way, my black guy ended up being the head elder / lay pastor of that church for 30 years. Good guy. So anyway, yeah, I mean, but here's the thing. You can look at that, we can look at that and say, that's evil, that's wrong. Why is it the young people think it's okay to destroy Israel and dislike Jews? It's unfathomable, it seems to me, yet it is here. And I think it has a direct impact on the question of changing, enforcing Sunday worship as opposed to Saturday worship, because anti-Semitism went straight to the Jewish Sabbath,
Probably because I work a lot with computers. But I've thought for the since the pandemic, I've often said and told people, all they really have to do is do a word search and replace Jew with Adventist.
Yeah. And have you done that?
No, but I mean, if you have a document, just thinking of it in a document standpoint, all it takes is to just replace the one word and put in something else, or replace COVID with Adventist, or replace Jew with Adventist. It's very little difference. It's the same thing, really. It's just that it's just a different name right now.
Yeah, see, that's why I'm not like Dwight Nelson, I think, told me I should let COVID go. I was on a panel debating him about Christian nationalism. He still hasn't learned the proper lesson, but nevertheless, he was saying to me, let COVID go. And I said, I'm not letting COVID go. COVID is a pressure test for individual freedom. And we flunked, And if we say, well, pay no attention to that, that's the wrong lesson, Anyway.
brothers.
The Yost brothers.
Bruce.
My favorite guys, right?
I keep looking at.
Jeff says he's known me since we're, what, 5 years old or 3 or something?
I remember before kindergarten, we were playing at church, Sabbath school, in the sandbox in the basement of the Berrien Springs courthouse, where we had church, and my brother was married there before it became the village church moved to where it is now.
This is Jeff's advantage over me. I can't remember anything before I was 18. So.
It's all those drugs you took, Bruce. Just kidding. Bruce was always one of the most spiritual persons that I knew growing up. So you hear me kid him a lot, and we do that with each other. But regardless, I'm looking at this freedom of religion that you spoke of with James Madison and its duty towards the Creator.
Yes.
Okay. Freedom of religion. And as you see the growth, which connects with Hamas, which connects with Palestine, which connects against the Jews, and as our country is being freedom of religion, we're allowing the Muslim populations to grow, and they're growing quite substantially. I don't know if you remember ever seeing a mosque, and we have freedom of religion, which I believe in. But my question to you is, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, my thoughts, hey, I'm a First Amendment guy, right? So if you're in the nation, you're a citizen, then you get the First Amendment. You can be a Muslim, you can be an Adventist, you can be Catholic, you could be, a Hindu, you can be whatever you want to be. But when you import a group whose culture is against religious liberty, is against democracy, what are you doing? The United States has the right to limit who comes in. That is where the decision needs to be made. And I'm not an expert in this area, but I will tell you, it is critical to our future freedom to have a core group that believe in religious liberty, that believe in democracy. And when we lose that, and we're beginning to lose that among our native population, when these young people are saying what they're saying, they don't believe in the First Amendment. You poll them about hate speech. They say, well, that shouldn't be permitted. That's an absolute violation of the First Amendment to say there's a hate speech exception, because how do you determine what hate speech is? If I don't like it, then I think it's hateful, and therefore you can't say it. So we need to do everything we can, it seems to me, to extend freedom. Now, I understand, Adventist eschatology is there'll come a time when we won't have freedom, but I don't think we should throw down our hands and say, okay, have at it, because what happens? God is in charge, God will decide, I think our obligation as his followers are to preserve his views, and his views are clearly in favor of religious freedom, and especially freedom to serve him. You're tired out. I have 3-hour classes, so it doesn't bother me to stand up for a while, though I am getting older. I'm 75, so my wife was talking to me, and she said, a 76-year-old, and I said, do I think I'm younger than I am? She said, no, you're 75. Anyway.
This is back to the COVID, and this happened in this church. And I think that we didn't have church for 2 weeks, and we went online and did the Zoom for those 2 weeks. And then after that, they said that we could, as long as we sat 6 feet apart, that we could come to church. There was a policeman that sat under that tree for 2 weeks, 2 different Sabbaths, and counted every person that came in. And he came in the middle door and peeked through the door and looked to see if we were 6 feet.
That is
I know
where
that. I saw that.
you need to sue. Because look, we went to Zoom as well. But let me tell you a little thing. The law school went to Zoom because, hey, we didn't have a religious belief that you had to have in-person classes. The students did more poorly when educated through Zoom. Face-to-face is important. Can you imagine if your church was consigned to Zoom from now on? The lack of interpersonal relationships, the lack of, I mean, you learn something. You look at me, you look at my body, not just what I'm saying, right? If you just look at my face, in fact, it's sometimes hard for me to recognize students, even though I'd seen their face for some time, when I saw their whole body. And, so anyway, the bottom line is face-to-face meeting is important for so many reasons. And when should the government be able to say, you have to sit 6 feet apart, and the police come in and say that? Especially, we know now, that's complete nonsense. I mean, the 6 feet was nothing. Now, look, I don't fault people who are scientists who are trying to figure out what things are and they don't have perfect knowledge at the beginning. I understand that. But the question is, who authorized the government to say, as opposed to the church, you can't meet? That's the question. So, yes. Well, smoke and mirrors. Anyway, okay? You want me to pray? Or you want me to ask? I'll stand here and answer questions as long as you want. My plane doesn't leave until tomorrow.
I did have one more question.
Yeah.
I didn't hear the results of the case where the Chica.
Cheeky won. He won in the sense the Supreme Court said, well, first of all, these expression zones are unconstitutional. Permits are unconstitutional. And so clearly Gwinnett was going to lose. And so the bad actors knew they were going to lose. And so they said, well, okay, we don't have that rule anymore, Supreme Court. Dismiss this case. And the importance of that case was the Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to let offenders just control whether or not we review a case.
So more than just it going moot, they still said those things were unconstitutional.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's, yes. The case I looked at was the one on the mootness. If there's a follow-up case, I might not be completely up to speed on that. So.
Thank you.
I actually went back and looked at the facts of these cases, so I would be able to answer questions like that. Because you ask me some of the details, I'm seeing wins increase. I mean, just look at Hardison and Abood 40 years ago, bad decisions. And Janus and Groff are good decisions. The court is absolutely, positively, regularly ruling in favor of religion. It's a blessing. It's an absolute blessing,
My second part of that question, after asking, are the cases increasing, is how are you guys funded? And do you have is there a section that comes out of whatever group and it's funding you guys, or how are you funded?
The National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation is funded by individual contributions. It's purely private charity, litigation charity. They get contributions from employees, from employers, from companies. By companies, I mean foundations. They're set up to give money to charity. We're not primarily a religious liberty group. When I interviewed with them 50 years ago, I said, because I saw this flyer that they help people with regard to labor unions, I said, bingo. I'd ask the church if they wanted to hire me. I said, I graduated from one of the top law schools in the country. I have one of the top grades in the class. I'm willing to work cheap about hiring me. And they essentially said, lawyer? We don't need a lawyer. Or they'd say, well, we just hired a lawyer, and I don't expect we won't expect to need any anytime soon. So I was looking around for, big firms were, so I could be wealthy. Didn't make me poor, but I wanted to do something to advance the kingdom of God. And so when I saw that flyer from Right to Work, I said, hey, consider me. They flew me up to DC, which is where their headquarters are, and they hired me almost immediately. And the reason was I was interning with the U.S. Department of Justice, and so I was in the Justice Honors Program. It was so new, I didn't understand there was anything special. I just understood it meant I could interview for positions in the federal government. They're connected to justice. And so I had interviewed with the antitrust division. Did I want to do antitrust law? No, but it would have been a great job. And if I worked there, I could go into a big firm and become fabulously wealthy. So I said to the right to work people, because this was about Thanksgiving when I interviewed, my third year, this was fall of my third year. The antitrust division is looking at me. Please decide soon, because I'd rather work for you. And so they said, in a couple of weeks or something, okay, we're going to hire you. So I had the luxury of my third year, I knew I'd be doing labor-related stuff. And so I was taking courses, because labor relations is a unique area of law, so I was taking courses on it so I would be available. But the interview, I told them, here's what I want to do. I'm an Adventist. I want to litigate cases have to do with religious liberty and labor unions. And they essentially said, knock yourself out. So yeah, I mean, it's the foundation allowed me to pioneer the law in the area. So it's all God's will. I mean, you know.
I want to clarify something I thought I heard you say earlier. My father worked as civil service, and they had a big union there. They allowed him to donate, quote unquote, what they would normally charge to the United Way, and that counted, quote unquote.
Okay, can I stop you for just a minute to clarify? Federal civil service or
Yes.
state?
On one of the Air Force bases, yes. This was a long time ago.
They're lying to your father.
Well, I thought I heard you say that as of whenever this case was settled, that
No,
they no
I mean,
longer have to do that.
Federal employees have never been required to pay union fees.
Wow.
Never.
Okay.
And that's still the case for today. Federal employees are not required to pay fees. High levels of unionization for state level employees and local government, right? But federal employees never allowed.
Well, I know that was kind of a sticking point with him, but he said, okay, I'd rather keep the job. So,
yeah, see, I will tell you, the United Way is not one that you want to get sucked into supporting, because unions would often suggest the United Way. A lot of my clients had opposition to supporting the union because the union was a pro-abortion lobby, and they were pro-life. And that's actually in the area where I pioneered the law. And the United Way promotes Planned Parenthood.
I know.
You know, so I mean, here, you have an objection to us promoting abortion? Here, pay the United Way, where unbeknownst to you, your money will be used.
That might be something that people were interested in. There is a website that you can check out people that are asking for money for donations and find out exactly how much goes towards it and what they provide and so forth and so on.
Yeah, the United, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on the United Way, but you can say to the United Way that I want my contribution to be directed to a certain organization, such as the Salvation Army is a beneficiary of United Way money. You have to ask them about how they deal with overhead, because for a lot of these United Way groups, they take 10% of your contribution, even though it's directed to the Salvation Army, and use it for overhead, which indirectly helps helps Planned Parenthood. You know, so it's just you know, it's complicated, unfortunately, and there are all sorts of ways to do we cheat them and how, you know. But like with your father, I mean, if your father was a federal employee, they're absolutely, positively lying to him.
There you go.
Yeah, it's too bad.
But you're saying now, even if it was
Right.
employees do no longer have to. I mean, they get to decide yes or no. I don't want to do this.
Yes. In fact, President Trump is taking out collective bargaining for federal employees.
Okay.
You know, the real question is, this is a thing that most people don't know. Federal employees don't bargain over their wages or their hours.
That's correct.
They bargain over the conditions of employment. Well, if you're talking about TSA, Homeland Security, what is it they're bargaining over? They're bargaining over things that are presumably national security related stuff. Those are the conditions of employment. So this is a this is an area which is charged with all sorts of problems. And President Trump has been taking out collective bargaining for federal employees. And the reason, and I don't want to get, as I said, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but say your father didn't want to join the union or pay fees. Did your father want to be represented by the union? See, for the federal employees, you can be compelled to be represented by the union. You just can't be compelled to join them or financially support them. And this is an area where I'm working on a law review article now. I'm actually trying to litigate this issue. Seventh-day Adventists have historically said that under Title VII, we want to redirect our union dues to charity. Okay, the church can decide that. They can, and almost all the early cases successfully litigated by the church involved the remedy that the employee got to pay to a charity. Let me ask you, let's say I'm your lawyer, and you find that I'm involved in all sorts of unseemly stuff that violates your religious beliefs. Would it be appropriate for you to say, well, I'm going to continue to use you as my lawyer, Bruce. I'm just going to pay a charity what I would owe you. Oh, what does that sound like? That sounds ridiculous. So why isn't it that the remedy is the union doesn't represent you anymore? If you think they're bad people, why, and I could get into this. In fact, let me tell you, there's going to be a big religious liberty meeting in Berrien Springs in August, I think it is. And I'm going to be speaking at it with regard to the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and labor unions. And I'm going to be talking about this because the Adventists pioneered this area of law. The area of law that they pioneered, you can look at and say, I'm not sure. Should Methodists be, limited by that? Catholics and all these other people? This is an Adventist remedy based on the history of the Adventist Church with regard to combat, And so I understand exactly how we got where we are. I can give you a biblical argument why their remedy is appropriate. But there are a lot of Christians who say, just like, why would I agree to be represented by this lawyer who's corrupt, and just pay my money somewhere else? That doesn't make any sense. Anyway, enough of that. That's C75. I still have goals. Okay, anyone else? You want to pray?
Sure. Whatever.
Yeah, unless someone else has a question. You have a question, you say? Oh, no, okay. You want me to pray?
Sure.
Sure. All right. Great God in heaven, I thank you for these people. These are your children, dear Lord. They care about your issues. They care about religious liberty. And Lord, I thank you that we have a place that we can freely discuss religious liberty. And I thank you, Lord, that they took their time to come and discuss this important matter. Thank you for your kindness to us. Thank you for your love. Thank you for your blessings. And we thank you for your Son. Amen. Amen.